and welcome to TELOS Forum, which is a festival of ideas related to TELOS magazine and a meeting point for different leaders global thinkers to discuss about the late-breaking social, cultural, technological, and scientific affairs worldwide. My name is José María Robles. I'm a journalist and your host today. So it's a big honor introducing Isabel Wilkerson, first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win the Pulitzer Prize, and also the author of a wonderful book called Casta, the origins of our discontents. Thank you very much, Mrs. Wilkerson, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Casta is a revealing story of people and history and a re-examination of what lies under the surface of American life today. Because beyond race or class, there is a powerful caste system that influences people's lives and people's behavior and even the country's fate. Mrs. Wilkerson is featuring her researching in just a second, but I think it's important to underline the motto of this TELOS Forum new edition, remembering the future. We would like to imagine a better, more human and fair, more technological and sustainable world. And at the same time, we would like to turn back to the past to see and understand its history processes. I cannot think of a better guide to look over history and help us to reshape tomorrow than Isabel Wilkerson.
Thank you so very much. It's such an honor to be speaking with you today because of the role and importance of inspiration for ideas to begin with when you're a writer. And so what I'll be speaking about today is the original research that I did as a writer of my first book, which is this one, The Warren Brothers' Sons, which led to the second book, Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents. And they are interconnected, and they also remind us about the human will to be free, the human will to be able to build upon the gifts that we're all born with. And what is it that people are doing when they are leaving one place for another place that they've never ever seen before in hopes that my life might be better? In other words, to migrate is what human beings do when they feel that they have no other choice. And in some ways, to migrate is it's almost what it means to be human. To be human often means to migrate. And so I'll be speaking about one of the biggest migrations that occurred within the United States of America, which helps to explain much of American history, particularly, well, for those inside the country and also outside of the country. So the Great Migration, which is the focus of my first book, meant that I had to understand what is it that propels anyone, anywhere in the world, to leave one place, the only place that they've ever known, for a place that they've never seen, in hopes that life might be better. What is it that propels people to leave the people that they had known, all the family members, all the ones that they love, the land and the space and the culture, for a completely different place? And that's what happened in the Great Migration inside the United States. And in that case, 6 million Black people who were restricted to the southern part of the country, southern part of the United States, fled or defected or sought political asylum within the borders of their own country. And what that means is that they were acting in the same ways that anyone who might ever leave any other part of the world for another part of the world. At the time that the Great Migration began around World War I, there were 90% of all Black people were living in one section of the country, the southern part of the country, which we connect with the idea of Jim Crow. By the time that this Great Migration ended in the 1970s, nearly half of all Black people were living all over the rest of the country. And so this Great Migration, in some ways, like every migration, is really not about geography. It's about freedom and how far people are willing to go to achieve it. And so the people of the Great Migration that I'm describing, Black people, were in some ways proxies for the people all over the world who may be even seeking political asylum or seeking refuge in other places right now. And we know that this has become a global crisis. and a crisis that will very likely continue as climate change becomes one of the drivers of people seeking to move from one place to another or relocate from one place to another. In the case of the migration that I've written about in the United States of African Americans, this migration was the only time in American history that American citizens had to flee the land of their birth, meaning the southern part, for other parts of the country just to be recognized as the citizens that they had always been. In other words, in the American context, in this country that many people have observed from afar, it turns out that no other group of American citizens had to act like immigrants in order to be recognized as citizens. And so thus, migration is really not about geography. We often get caught up in the geography of it, but it actually is about how far people are willing to go to achieve their dreams, achieve their goals, raise their families, achieve what they believe to be as freedom. And so the Great Migration was, in some ways, it was a seeking of political asylum within the borders of their own country. And because the parts of the country were so very different, it was in some ways like leaving one country for another. What they were doing was they were defecting a caste system, a hierarchy, and a regime known as Jim Crow that was so repressive that it actually was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers or chess together in Alabama, if you can believe it. That means that someone had to have seen a Black person and a white person playing checkers together in some town square and felt that the entire foundation of Southern civilization was in peril, and decided to take the time to write a law prohibiting Black people and white people from merely playing checkers together. How innocent would that be? And yet this was seen as an affront, as a threat to the social order that they had created. This caste system of Jim Crow was so arcane and so extreme that in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. That means that the very word of God was segregated. It means that the same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. That is how extreme the world that they were fleeing was. And in a way to show how extreme it was and why this was a matter in some ways of life and death is that these are arcane and almost it sounds like petty distinctions. But these infractions, if you broke these rules, if you broke these customs, if you broke these laws, could literally mean one's life. In the American South, in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, an African American, a Black person, was killed by lynching every 3 to 4 days in the American South. And that means that, of course, we need to remind ourselves that this was basically a public display where people would gather around, thousands of people would gather around as an individual outside of the law was often attacked, assaulted, mutilated, and then killed publicly in front of crowds of thousands of cheering people. This is the world that they were fleeing. And when they did, as in any migration throughout human history, they followed beautifully predictable streams, as we can see in today's migration situation, where people do not just end up going anywhere just randomly. They often plot and they strategize and they look at who has gone where before, and then they make their decision about where they will go. And so in the United States, if you were to go to certain cities, for example, into New York or to Chicago or to Los Angeles or to Detroit, all these cities, if you were to meet an African American, you can know exactly what state in the South their families were from as a part of the Great Migration, because they followed beautifully predictable streams. A way of understanding the magnitude of the migration in the United States that I'm describing is to put it in the terms of American history in this way. This Great Migration was the first time in American history that people who had been assigned the very lowest rung of the social order chose to or signaled that they had options and they were willing to take them. And this is significant because we have to think about the history of the United States means that for the majority of the time that there's been a United States, African Americans were held in a fixed place. For 246 years, 12 generations, they were held in enslavement. They were consigned to being slaves. What they looked like, their physical manifestation, the physical characteristics that no one has any control over, were used to identify and to create an entire caste or group of people who would be consigned to enslavement without any hope of escape. And this went on for 12 generations. This was in some ways holding people hostage on labor camps throughout the South to build the United States, to build the country out of wilderness before there was the United States of America. This enslavement lasted for so long that it won't be until next year, 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. And another way of looking at it is that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free in the United States for as long as they were enslaved. That will not happen until the year 2111. Just imagine, it will not be until 2111 that Black people in the United States will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. And so this great migration, this outpouring of people fleeing one part of the country for another part of the country was, as I said, it was a seeking of political asylum, but it also was basically the first time that the people who had been assigned to the lowest rung of the ladder, consigned to enslavement, consigned to servitude, signaled that they had options and were willing to take them. And secondly, that it was the first time they had the chance to choose for themselves what they would do with their God-given talents and where they would pursue them. That had not happened in the long history of the United States up until that point, up until the time of World War I, because people had been held in a fixed place as either slaves or servants primarily in this country. And so when you think about the pictures that we might have seen of the cotton fields and the tobacco fields and the rice plantations and the sugar plantations of the American South. We may have all seen pictures of them. On those tobacco fields, on those cotton fields, on those sugar plantations, and on those rice plantations were opera singers, jazz musicians, playwrights, novelists, surgeons, architects, engineers, attorneys, teachers, all kinds of people. But for the vast majority of the time that there was a United States, as a result of the hierarchy, as a result of the embedded social order that consigned one group of people to the bottom with no hope of escape, because of that, these people who might have been opera singers, jazz musicians, playwrights, novelists, surgeons, and all of that were held in a fixed place in servitude and thus not able to fulfill their true gifts and talents because they were consigned to the bottom. The other thing is that when you hold people in a fixed place, that means that it takes energy in order to do that, a tremendous waste of energy and time, resources to hold an entire group of people at the very bottom. And in doing so, that means that those who were the powers that be in that system of Jim Crow in the American South were themselves being held back, were themselves holding back the entire region, because that region of the country was lagging economically, lagging in terms of infrastructure, lagging in terms of development, because they were in some ways holding fast to a feudal system that kept an entire group of people at the very bottom, kept an entire group of people in servitude, and thus it kept them in servitude to the very structure that they had created, and thus holding back the entire region. As a result of the people leaving, there are so many people who we now recognize as being very well-known, famous people in American culture and become known all over the world as a result of the people leaving in the Great Migration. In other words, before there was this Great Migration, before there was this outpouring of people, before they fled in order to develop and to build their talents and to raise their children in a freer environment, there was no opportunity for there to be a Toni Morrison. Her parents were from Alabama and Georgia. They migrated to Ohio, where had they not migrated to Ohio, their daughter, Toni Morrison, at the time that she would have been growing up in Alabama, where it was actually illegal for a Black person to walk into a library and take out a library book, if you can imagine. Libraries were prohibited for Black people in the American South. And thus, but merely by leaving, Toni Morrison's parents assured that their daughter would get access to books. And if you're going to become a Nobel laureate, it helps to get a book now and then. It's actually necessary if you're going to become a writer to be able to have access to books. And their migration made it possible, made a way for their daughter to become one of the most famous, most beloved authors of the 20th century, or perhaps ever, known all over the world. And this would not have been possible before the people took it upon themselves to seek political asylum, to seek freedom someplace else. When we think about the music as we know it, it's hard to imagine music had there not been a great migration. And such people as Miles Davis, whose parents were in Arkansas and they migrated to Illinois, where their son would get the access to being able to learn and get lessons in music, and to be able to fulfill that talent, which was within him all along, but which could have gone fallow in the cotton fields and the rural and small town restrictions of Arkansas had his parents not made that move at that time. Thelonious Monk, his parents were from North Carolina, and they migrated to New York, where his mother worked cleaning office buildings rather than picking tobacco in North Carolina, and she managed to be able to save up for an upright piano that she just hoped her son would someday learn to play. And thus changing music as we know it, jazz in particular. And then even John Coltrane. John Coltrane, we might not even have known his name had there been no migration, because he was from North Carolina, as was Thelonious Monk. He migrated right after high school at the age of 17 to Philadelphia, where it was not until he got to Philadelphia that he got his first alto sax. There are people around the world who cannot imagine music without John Coltrane having emerged and made his mark in jazz and in music. And yet this is someone whose name we might not have known had there been no great migration. Motown is a creation of the great migration. Berry Gordy, his parents were from Georgia. They migrated to Detroit, Michigan. And as a result of that, he grew up surrounded by other children of the Great Migration. And he saw, for example, these three girls. One was Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and a third one, Diana Ross. They were teenagers, one of the many children whose parents had come from the South to the North, bringing with them on their hearts and in their spirits the music that has sustained their ancestors, the blues music, the gospel music, and the spirituals that had sustained them. And so he saw all of these young people, from Marvin Gaye to Smokey Robinson to Diana Ross, and he recognized their talent, and he thus created an entire company and sound in music that might not have been possible had there been no great migration, because the people would not have been there in order to build that structure. Migration ultimately then becomes an expression of one's dreams for oneself, and any place that is receiving huge numbers of migrants is in some ways a place that, if you turn it around and think of it, means that it's a place that is thriving. What you don't want is, you do not want to be a place that people do not want to migrate to, because that means that you are not thriving. In other words, people coming and migrating become a referendum on the places that they're leaving, and a show of hope and belief in a place that is more vibrant, a place that holds hope for them. In other words, it is a wonderful thing to be a place that people want to migrate to. That does not mean that there are not requirements, there are not standards and they're not policies that one might enact. But what I'm saying is that the Great Migration is a way of understanding that there's a tremendous amount of infusion of energy, infusion of new blood, infusion of new ways of looking at a culture, infusion of talent and genius and possibility that grow from a migration into a place. And also, and as I said, a migration to a particular place is in some ways a vote of confidence in a place. It's an indication that that place is thriving and doing well. We would not want to be a place where people do not want to migrate. I wanted to say a little bit too about what we've seen in recent years, particularly focusing on the United States, which is the place that I obviously know best and where I've done my research. And I want to say that, you know, what we've seen in recent years, and we saw a year and a half ago, all of us around the world saw a human being killed before our very eyes, something that most Americans, most human beings never see unless they are in war or perhaps in hospitals. And that is most of us never see a human being killed before our very eyes. And yet in May of 2020, we saw George Floyd killed before our very eyes, people around the world. It was captured on video. We saw his life drained from him, his humanity stripped from him, and over what? We learned that it was over the accusation that he had presumably attempted to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. And for this, we saw that he lost his life. And we also, in the trial that concluded just a few months ago, we found out that that was not even an infraction that required an arrest. It was an infraction that required, generally was handled with a citation and then a court date. So that means that he did not even need to be arrested. And that means that he should be alive today. And so this is an example of the ways in which the ways in which people who were assigned to the very bottom of the society, the very bottom of the hierarchy, going back to the founding, even before the founding of the country, still bear the burden, still bear the consequences of the idea that anything at all can be done to people who are born to the very bottom of the society. And that is one of the things that we are having to see even to this day, and the impact that has on our society. One of the things that I think we've discovered in this country in recent years is that we as a country have many people are acknowledging that we have not addressed, much less reconciled, our history. We have recognized that we have not addressed what we are facing as a nation. We have recognized that in some ways no one was held to account for the 246 years of enslavement that I've just described. No one was held to account even for the Civil War that occurred in the 19th century that was fought over whether there should be people held at the bottom as enslaved people. There was no one held to account for the Civil War and the rupture of Civil War that the Confederates mounted against the North and against the rest of the country, that no one was held to account for that. In fact, there are actually monuments to those people. And we have seen that there are monuments throughout the world, sadly, to those who were the leaders of and the ones who profited from the transatlantic slave trade. We saw last year, as a result of the outrage and uprisings over what happened to George Floyd, that in Bristol in the UK, there was the monument of Edward Colston, I believe his name was, who was a merchant, one of the most powerful slave merchants, who had a monument to him in a town square in Bristol. That the people, outraged by what happened to George Floyd, made the connection between history and our current era. And there are a tremendous number of videos and photographs that show that people in that city tore down that statue, dragged it through the streets of Bristol, and then hurled it into the harbor, hurled it into the water there. And it became an international spectacle, that was a way of understanding how we in the current day have been tasked with the responsibility of explaining to succeeding generations, how is it that some of the things that we're seeing could be happening? How is it that we could see a human being being killed before our very eyes in the 21st century? We should be more evolved than that as a species, and how we are now having to confront and reckon with this history that any country in this world that was a part of the transatlantic slave trade is having to grapple with, having to reckon with. What is it that we as a species did to other members of our own species for so many centuries, and thus creating hierarchy based upon what people look like, that spread throughout colonization and enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade. We are now just coming to having to grips with the power and the consequences of this longstanding, these human rights abuses, these crimes against humanity that occurred and that we are still living with to the current day. I would just like to basically close with the idea that we are faced with having to deal with these things because we as a species are facing globally this karmic moment of truth. Our divisions are endangering our future. Our divisions are endangering our planet. Our divisions are endangering our species. We have no choice but to find a way past and through these challenges, to find a way to transcend our differences in order to come together for the global existential crisis that we are facing. We don't have options. We don't have time. We don't have time for the continued divisions. We don't have time for caste. We don't have time for hierarchy. We have to find a way to work together to save ourselves and our planet. We have seen in recent years and in the current moment that the dreams and the message of Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, have not been completed. He is one who said that we need to find a way past the darkness and the division and past the hate and the hierarchy that have riven our humanity for centuries, if not millennia, and to rise to what he called the heights of the majestic and live up to the possibility of our species. What we've seen has made it wrenchingly clear that Dr. King's mission has not yet been completed. And it will be up to all of us, every member of our species. I've taken to refer to us not just as people, but as a species, because we need to remind ourselves that we have more in common with each other than we have in differences, that the fate of one person on this planet affects the fate of all of us on this planet. And it will be up to all of us, but particularly to the prime beneficiaries of the hierarchies that have been created around the world, the hierarchies that grew out of the transatlantic slave trade. It will be up to those who were the beneficiaries of it in particular to make it so, not only for our communities, our children, our individual countries, but for the species and for the planet itself. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wilkerson. That was really inspiring. In December 2017 at London, you were asked directly what place you occupied in the USA caste system.
Yeah.
It meant a shock for you. How did you internally deal up to that point with silence, lack of empathy, and complicity between members of the dominant caste?
Yes. So what you're speaking of is I happen to have been at a conference in London where most of the people were Indian, meaning they were immigrants from India, British citizens who had immigrated from India. So they were. I was speaking about caste, and I was speaking about how caste could be applied to the United States. And in doing so, speaking to this one individual who happened to have been from the second-ranked caste in India, the second-ranked Varna, I should say, in India, he asked me very earnestly and innocently in some ways, well, where would you be positioned if there is caste in the United States? Where would you be positioned? And I was stunned that he asked that, because it's so very apparent when you're in the United States. I mean, no one would ever question where presumably I would be positioned. No one would wonder about the history and the where historically people who look like me would be positioned. And so I was really surprised and stunned that he had not, he didn't think in those terms. It was refreshing to me to see that someone was open-minded enough to consider the possibilities that that the hierarchy could possibly be different. And what it shows is that people who are born into a hierarchy such as that that has existed in the United States and in every, I should say, country in the Western Hemisphere, in fact, where that was touched by the transatlantic slave trade, where it was so obvious where people stood. And yet here was someone who saw things so differently. And it showed that when you are a part of a hierarchy, as is the case in the countries that were part of the transatlantic slave trade or the receiving places of the transatlantic slave trade, you realize how much you have incorporated that view into yourself. In other words, in order to survive, you have to absorb the messaging. You have to recognize that this is the programming that everyone has, and you realize how deeply embedded that is. You know, how you don't even question why would anyone ask where you fit in the hierarchy when it's so obvious. So I found it to be very refreshing that he asked that. It was a beautiful moment from my perspective, but it showed how much we have absorbed, how much African Americans or other groups who've been marginalized in these societies have had to adjust themselves to the expectations of others, adjust themselves to the stereotypes and assumptions that others might have as a protective mechanism in order to survive in that society.
Mhm. We are talking about an artificial hierarchy that has been built during 250 years.
Yeah.
In your opinion, which one of the 8 pillars of the caste system you point to in your book would be easier to demolish?
Well, that is a really, really, really tough question because so much of it is deeply embedded. I mean, the first one has to do with essential belief systems that often are tied to religious and spiritual traditions that have this seemingly primordial, deeply embedded existential purpose that everybody is born to. It's a natural order of things that can never be overcome. And I think that actually is the most difficult one to overcome. I think that hopefully one of the two that come to mind that are most readily addressed and actually have begun to be addressed would be the occupational restrictions on who can do what in a society. That's something that any society can begin working on, and of course that has happened in many of these countries. Of course, it's happened in the United States as well, where we see people who've been able to break through. Let me say that one of the examples of that is that during one of the results of the civil rights movement in the United States was the civil rights legislation, one of which outlawed or prohibited discrimination against people on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, skin color, and gender. So that it opened up the world for women who, of all races, who otherwise, and let me just emphasize, white women, for example, who had been restricted in what they could do, they ended up being the prime beneficiaries of the civil rights legislation that African Americans and others who were protesting and taking the lead in protesting the restrictions of Jim Crow and the restrictions of this caste system in general. It turned out that white women were the prime beneficiaries, partly because there were a larger number of them, and they were able to move into positions that they had never been in before. Also, African Americans were able to benefit. They did not benefit to the same degree that white women did, but they were able to move into positions that they had not been able to. As I said, in my remarks, that there were people who were on those cotton fields who could have been lawyers and physicians and teachers. And that is where we have to acknowledge that there has been progress, because I think that is the one pillar that is most readily corrected for, most readily opened up. That does not mean that enough has been done. We have a long, long way to go, but that's the one that probably is most readily overcome, and we've made progress. I would say the second one would be the impulse or the perceived need to enforce this caste system, to enforce hierarchy, to keep people in a fixed place by using violence and force. I really hope and pray that that is a pillar that we can begin to overcome. Obviously, the uprisings all over the world in the summer of 2020 were a response to the need to overcome that pillar of caste, but we have a very long way to go. Even today, right now, there are 2 trials going on in the United States that speak to the use of force, the violence at the hands of actual citizens who are positioning themselves as self-appointed enforcers of the social order that's going on right now. And so we have a long way to go, but I think there's an awareness that it needs to be addressed. And I'm hopeful that that, along with the occupational restrictions, would be the ones that could be directly corrected for more quickly, perhaps, than the others.
You mentioned a very significant experiment, the one that a teacher called Miss Elliott carried out in a little town from Iowa in the late 60s. She segregated her students according to the color of their eyes. Brown colored pupils couldn't drink from the fountain and also couldn't enjoy an extra portion of after lunchtime. And blue colored pupils had certain advantages at first, but later they became the casualties. The best way, Mrs. Wilkerson, to make visible what the subjugation of the caste system implies is by making the dominant caste put itself in the shoes of the subordinate.
Yeah, I that is not the full answer. You know, that is not going to resolve in the United States 400 years of history and hierarchy that we are just beginning to really understand. It's one thing that is necessary. But these are really structural issues in a society. It has to do with the various systems within a society when it comes to healthcare. We have seen the inequities and the disparities in the country where people who have been historically assigned to the very bottom of the hierarchy or marginalized people, or the ones who are more likely to be in positions, work positions where they were exposed to the public without PPE, in other words, without the protective equipment, and thus more vulnerable to being exposed to the virus, contracting the virus, and ultimately dying as a result of the virus. African Americans and Indigenous people are the groups that were most that have been most affected by this virus, by this COVID-19, in terms of deaths and severe illness, so that one's positioning in the hierarchy correlates with the likelihood of being really truly affected by it, in terms of being able to, in terms of not only contracting it, but what happens afterward, because these are people often who may not have health care, they may not have health insurance, they may not have access to health care to be able to help them through that. They may be treated differently once they enter the health system. So these are systemic issues. We also see issues in education, issues in criminal justice. So these are systemic issues. At the same time, that study in which this Iowa teacher took these third graders and separated them, decided that she wanted to teach them what happens, how arbitrary these distinctions are. So all of those children were what we would consider to be white without question. They were all primarily of say, let's say, German and Scandinavian descent, living in Iowa farm towns. And so the only distinction that she could choose to make was the color of their eyes, and she divided them up by that. And one of the startling things that occurred was that the children instantly began to arrange themselves into a hierarchy. They instantly began to believe that on the basis of this arbitrary characteristic that no one has any control over, the color of one's eyes, whether they're blue or whether they're brown, would suddenly be the determining factor of whether they were smart, whether they were capable, whether they were reliable, whether they were responsible, or whether they were lazy, whether they were dumb, whether they were slow, all of those things. And they bought into it. And so I remember in that case, one of the kids were playing in the playground during the day that this experiment was going on, and the children who that day were identified as or told that they were inferior were being taunted by the children who were told that they were superior because their eyes were blue. And so one of the little boys went to the teacher and said, this boy was bullying me. One of the boys with blue eyes was bullying me and made me feel bad, and he was calling me names. And she said, well, what was he calling you? And he said, brown eyes. And that means that in an instant, a characteristic that should have no meaning other than the beautiful range of human physical manifestation had been turned into a stigma, had been turned into a source of humiliation, had been turned into something that was perceived as inferior, totally arbitrary, as with skin color. And that instantly, merely being told that and being affirmed in just a matter of hours, the children picked up on it, but it showed the impact on those who were marginalized, and how instantly these kids have been friends, they've grown up together, and instantly, merely by even describing an individual neutrally on the basis of the characteristic that had then been designed or seen as negative, as inferior, as stigmatized, just calling the person by that characteristic was seen as a bullying assault on that person. That shows you the impact. If that can happen in a matter of hours to children, what is the impact of hundreds of years of hierarchy, hundreds of years of programming that an entire group of people is inferior to another group of people that is presumed to be superior? What is the impact of that? Not just in one country, but globally, because colonization ended up diminishing and assigning people of African descent all over the world to the very bottom of what could be seen as a global caste system. And so this is something that we as a species need to confront, because again, no one has control over their physical manifestations. It is an affront to the beauty of the human species that has this range of beautiful manifestation. We should be celebrating the ways in which humanity has found ways to express itself physically. There should be no hierarchy on the basis of what people look like. And there is no connection between the color of one's eyes and intelligence or worthiness, brilliance, creativity. And there's no connection between the color of one's skin and intelligence, wisdom, and beauty and genius. There's no connection. And if we continue to believe in that as a species, then we will be holding ourselves back and not finding ways to recognize how much we have in common and how much we have to come together because the species and the planet are in peril.
Mm-hmm. As I said before, this new edition of TELOS Forum has a motto, a significant motto. It's remember the future. So let's talk about past and future. According to estimates by the US Census Bureau in 2042, and for the first time in the country's history, white people would cease to be the majority in a nation that has not known any other configuration before. As you point out, the result will be an ethnic distribution potentially closer to South African reality than what Americans are used to. However, you believe the change in demographics could have a much less material impact than people expect. Are we talking about a more divided scenario than the current one?
Well, one of the reasons that I mention this is because we have 20 years as a society in this country to plan for, anticipate, and in some ways reimagine how groups interact with one another, how the society will manage a new configuration that it has never experienced. So, to reiterate what that configuration is, since the founding of what is now the United States, the majority has been of people who are identified as white. I want to remind people that the idea of people being white or black or some other thing, some other designation in between, is a relatively new concept in human history, because throughout much of human history, I mean, millennia ago, people would not have identified themselves on the basis of what we now consider to be race. People were, as we know, restricted or confined or focused on having the places where they had migrated. So there were people in Europe, there were people in what is now Asia. There were people who were clusters of people who all looked similar to one another, and then were speaking similar, had similar cultures, but were not necessarily identifying or needing to identify themselves on the basis of their skin color. And then when the Western Hemisphere began to be developed in the way that it did, of course, in alignment with or parallel to the transatlantic slave trade, that is when you had people from all parts of the world who looked different, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that they look different. They all were coming together, some by force, some by choice, into these spaces. And thus there came to be this delineation of people who would have had no reason to identify themselves on the basis of of their skin color. I mean, when the United States, what is now the United States, was being founded, you had people who were from what is now coming from England. You had people coming from Ireland. You had people coming from Germany and from the Netherlands, or from Poland, other parts of different parts of Europe, where they would not have seen themselves as being the same people. They would have seen themselves as German. They would see themselves as Irish. They would have seen themselves as Polish. They would have seen themselves as Dutch, but they would not have seen themselves as the same people, particularly those arriving after the country was founded. They were speaking different languages. They had different culture, different lineage. But by arriving in what is now the United States, I'm speaking about the United States, which I know best, they were then funneled into a category that had no reason for existing until there was a society that was building essentially a hierarchical caste system on the basis of what people look like. So people arrived here as Irish, but then were converted into, or adding to, or entering a group, an artificially created group known as white, which they would not have identified with before. So we need to remind ourselves, it sounds, we've lived with it for so long that we accept this as the primordial truth of humanity, when actually we need to remind ourselves that this is a creation of humanity, that color is a fact, but race is a social construct. It's a social and political construct. And so we are living with the after effects of that. And thus this group known as white, this created group of people who were from different parts of Europe with different languages and different cultures, were coalescing into a group known as white in this country. I should also emphasize that in Australia, a country with some similar parallel dynamics, the use of the term, they identify by those originating nationalities, and they will identify as Greek, or they'll identify as Irish. They still do that. But in this situation where there was enslavement, there was this black and white paradigm, a polarity that was created. And so to get back to your question, the majority of the people in this in the society that was created, that is now the United States, the majority from the time of its founding was what is the group now known as white. And so census projections going into the year 2042 are suggesting that by the year 2042, as a result of migration and birth rates, the United States will no longer have that same historic majority of people who were of European descent identified as white in this country. And that is a configuration that no one in the country of any background has ever experienced. And so this is a chance for the country to reimagine what that looks like. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book, which is what you referred to, is that there are many people who would assume or are fearful. There's some people who are fearful that it means that there would be that they would lose their influence, or they would lose their power. And what I think we need to look to is to see what has happened, for example, in South Africa, a country that shares some of the same racial dynamics that the United States has experienced, meaning a regime of segregation called Jim Crow in the United States, called apartheid. In South Africa, we should remind ourselves that apartheid followed Jim Crow. Jim Crow was very long, well in place by the time that apartheid was created in South Africa. And so we need to look to see how is it that South Africa has what has happened in South Africa and what can be learned from it. Because what happens is when you have a long-standing hierarchy in which one group of people has been the dominant group, both economically, politically, and socially, then there's no reason to believe that that dominance will change merely because the numbers change. I mean, that's what we see with South Africa. And that's what I think I would hope that the country, that the United States, would begin to look at that and to recognize that that's one of the places that we need to examine and consider, because that is one way that this could unfold.
You mentioned before climate change as a challenge for immigration phenomenon in the mid-term or short term. We know what happened in the USA with the great migration, when millions of people were looking for better conditions for freedom. We have seen in recent times here in Europe, and we are still seeing right now in Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea area, what happened when millions of people are looking for better condition for their life. My question is, how can prepare USA and Europe for a change in the future, to absorb so millions of people coming out from hot countries to cold countries?
I cannot answer to the policies that European countries need to impose to manage their migration influx. I can only say the things that I'm saying are to help us to reframe what it is that we're looking at. Let's understand, what is it that's propelling the people to flee? What is it that is the motivating factor as to why they feel the need to, in some ways, evacuate or to immigrate out of the places that they're from? Having spent so much time, I spent 15 years on The Warmth of the Suns, the book that my first book, and I spent a lot of time researching the psychology of migration, the economics of migration, the politics of migration. What is it that happens? Why is this happening? And I think one of the things that you learn from, for example, the Great Migration was in some ways an object lesson in what can happen and what we can learn from it. The reason is because the Great Migration began. It unfolded over the course of decades, and then it ended. It ended in the 1970s. Why did it end? Why did it end? And the reason that it ended is because of the Great Migration, and also because of what was going on in the South, the resistance and the brave protests of Black people and also white people who joined them, protesting the injustices of the Jim Crow caste system. They actually, the pressure of people migrating out of the South, combined with the brave protests of those who stayed, put so much pressure on the entire country, the United States, that they finally changed the laws to thus make it such that the South was no longer the unwelcoming, very difficult place for Black people to live. In other words, solving the problems of the place where the people are leaving is one of the best ways to deal with an influx of migrants that another place cannot perhaps hold or truly incorporate. And so what I think what happens in a migration is that it creates an unexpected, perhaps, but necessary and very real partnership, whether one is looking for it or not, with the places that the people are leaving and the places that the people are arriving. And thus, in other words, any place, any country, any region of a country that has a large influx of people has by definition entered into a partnership with the place they're leaving, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And that means that means that the place that is the receiving station, I call it the receiving station, the receiving place, thus then has an interest in what is going on in the places that the people are leaving. And thus, because the places that the people are arriving are often have more in the way of resources, have more in the way of often power, have more in the way of economic power and resources, that there is a role in theory that could be played if people recognize that there's a reason why the people are leaving. So the question is, why are the people leaving? What is going on where they are? And what is it that the places that they are arriving to can do, not just to reject the people that are arriving, but to help make it such that the conditions that are forcing them to leave are somehow remediated, alleviated, and helped. Whether we want to accept it or not, whether a country recognizes it or not, the two countries, you're in a partnership. You're in a partnership from that moment, and thus there comes a connection, a relationship that that one needs to acknowledge and to respond to. And that is the Great Migration ended only when the conditions of the place that they were leaving began to change. And the Great Migration absolutely ended in the 1970s.
I'm afraid that we are running out of time. So, Mrs. Wilkerson, please let me ask you a question that any viewer could ask in this very moment. Where a Spanish average citizen, male or female, would fit in the caste hierarchy if he or she will move to the United States to work next week, for instance? Would the color of the skin determine his or her position in the system, apart from her professional skill, the salary level, or any other social, economic, or cultural factor?
Well, let me say that is such a great question, and it also shows how caste affects everybody up and down the hierarchy. In other words, there's caste within caste. So Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader of India, the leader of the what were formerly known as the Untouchables, said there's never caste. It's always castes, plural, always. There's no such thing as one caste. You can't have a caste system with just one. And so when you start creating a hierarchy, there's hierarchy within hierarchy. So there's a dominant group at the very top, and then there's a very bottom rung at the very bottom, the people who are the descendants of enslaved people. Those at the very top are those who are descended from or have a similar culture or lineage of those who were the founders of what is now the United States, meaning people who are of British descent are the very top. And then there are the gradations all the way to get to the very bottom rung, which would be people who are descended from those who were enslaved. There are gradations within the bottom rung, people who are more recent immigrants who were not descended from enslavement, enter a society in which they often are held at a higher sense of status than those who were born to a lineage of enslavement. So there's a recognition of that. But also at the very top, the gradations that suggest that those who are from the who are descended from Britain are at the very, very top, and then gradations down from other parts of Europe. And one way that we know that is that the immigration laws of the United States have indicated the value attached to individuals even coming from Europe, so that people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe there were prohibitions on their entering the country. at the turn of the 20th century. And the eugenics movement of the early 20th century established, in their view, a distorted and twisted ranking of people even within Europe. And so as a result of that, people who are from Southern Europe, people from Spain, for example, are part of the group that would be part of the dominant group, meaning that because they're white, but they would be seen as at the lower end of the dominant group. And I say this, I do not believe in this. I'm saying this as a reminder of the absurdity, the absolute absurdity of hierarchy to begin with. And we must find a way as humans to transcend this. We have to find a way to transcend this.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wilkerson. It was a pleasure to have you online. And again, thank you very much for your words and their thoughts, and congratulations for your book.
Thank you.